The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Alan Blumkin on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. We're doing another session of David Nemec's old-time baseball and trivia and history. And with me today is my co-host, David Nemec, and our perpetual guest, Ian Kahanowitz. And we're going to be discussing part two of the evolution of baseball rules. We'll pick up where we left off last week. And again, David Nemec is an authority on this. He wrote a terrific book a number of years ago on baseball rules. Welcome, gentlemen.
Welcome to both of you. Good to be with you again.
Okay.
Always a pleasure.
Okay, David, you want to start where
we
left off?
We were in the midst
you mentioned
of the
yesterday. You want to add a couple of things from last week.
The 1884 season was a very turbulent season. We didn't get into the discussion of some of the ramifications of player movement and how it was changing, and the rules as far as allowing player movement were changing. In 1880, when the reserve clause went in for the first time, I believe it was up to 6 players, and each team could be reserved for the following year. And it was regarded as, a bonus to be considered good enough to be reserved, a compliment to your talents. And players soon started realizing, wait a minute, we're bound like chattels. We're not free to move. I don't like playing for Providence anymore. I don't like playing for Cleveland. I want to play for Chicago. Those players who were reserved were bound. Players who weren't reserved, the lesser talents, were free to move and take the money if they could get a higher salary. So by 1884, this culminated in the formation of the Union Association, which rated the 2 existing major leagues, the American Association and the National League for Talent, did not abide, by the fact that players were reserved necessarily. They did a really massive raid, took some stars from Cleveland. They took Fred Dunlap, who ended up being the poster boy for the Union Association. They took some good pitchers and some great pitchers, and the Union Association shot itself in the foot because the progenitor of it, Henry Lucas, owned the St. Louis Maroons, and one of the things he did above all was to make sure his team was going to be the class of the league. And it was. It won its first 20 games, got out to a 20-0 start, and in an almost made it almost impossible for any other team to ever catch up during the season. And of course, none did. And it also included it as its 8th franchise, the smallest city in Major League Baseball history, at least after the National League was formed in 1876. I believe Mansfield, Connecticut may actually have been smaller. But Altoona, Pennsylvania got a team, and Lucas made sure that his Maroons would get off to a good start by scheduling many of his early games against Altoona and burying them as predicted. And Altoona soon folded, and the league became a mess of franchises that folded, and really only a couple, excluding St. Louis, finished the year intact. Boston, Baltimore, Washington, and Cincinnati finished, but the other 3 franchises went through several different changes. And the result of all this, when the Union Association collapsed, is there were a lot of players who suddenly were thrown on the open market, and it became a free-for-all as to what was going to happen to these guys. And there was a rule intact that you couldn't sign. The National League and the American Association had a rule intact that you could not sign a player until 60 days had passed if he had, if you were going to sign a player that was a free agent that played with his former team. So players like Tim Keefe and Dude Esterbrook, who had been on the 1884 Mets, and we'll discuss the Mets and the Providence element of 1884 in a moment. The Mets had Keefe and Estabrook, who were very much coveted by the New York National League team. And the New York National League team actually took these players away from the United States, I believe in islands somewhere in I think it might have been the Bahamas or something like that, and kept them there for the entire 60 days so that no other teams could find out where they were and make them better offers. And the Mets and the Giants ended up signing Keefe and Estabrook and becoming a very formidable team in 1885. And other players like Tony Mullane decided not to return to the Americans. They had originally been with St. Louis before jumping their contracts and going to Union Association. And Mullane was attracted back to the National League or the American Association by money being poured into the Toledo team by other owners, and he ended up pitching for Toledo, which folded after a year. And then Mullane decided he was going to declare himself a free agent after promising he'd return to St. Louis, and signed with Cincinnati. Ended up being suspended for the entire season. And there's a lot of stuff like this going on. There was no rules in place as yet as to how players whether they could be traded, whether they could be sold, how they would move from one team to another. So it was kind of a catch-as-catch-can proposition. And in the 1885 season, there was such a surplus of players on the open market that when the season started, there were almost no real rookies as such. And the rookie crop in 1885 was the sparsest it's ever been in Major League history. But because the Union Association had disbanded and the American Association reduced from 12 teams to 8, there were now only 16 teams on the market in the Major League horizon. And 2 of those teams were the pennant-winning Providence Grays from 1884 and the New York Mets, which had engaged in the first postseason series between 2 different major leagues. And that was had a World Series. All the games were held in New York because it was a much bigger market than Providence. Larger attendance could be predicted. And all the games were played, because it was in New York, by American Association rules, which were different to National League rules. The American Association had the hit batsman rule in place. And Tim Keefe, who was pitching for the Mets in the opening game, promptly hit the first 2 Providence hitters and got the Mets off to a terrible start. They ended up losing all 3 games. But the World Series became an annual event as a result of the 1884 season. As long as the American Association and the National League lasted until the very last American Association season in 1891. But now we're going into the 1885 season with the American Association still only allowing sidearm pitching, the National League overhand pitching. And that ended on June 7th, I believe, in a special meeting among American Association owners. And they came to the conclusion, let's dispense with, all this controversy about whether our pitchers throwing sidearm, overhand, whatever. Let's just allow a pitcher to pitch any way he wanted. And that rule then made for some very strange pitching throughout Major League Baseball. Pitchers did not have to face the hitter before they went into their motion to deliver the ball. Pitchers did not have to stand stationary, plant a foot on a slab or anything. There was a box. They were pitching from a box. They could start at one corner of the box and dart across the box and pitch from the other corner. They could pitch while they're jumping into the air in midair. And there's a pitcher called Jumping Jack Jones who did exactly that. He delivered the ball when he was off his feet in midair. There were all kinds of pitching deliveries, all kinds of pitching motions, and as a result, pitching in 1885 became very dominant, and hitting was down. throughout baseball. And at this point, I'd like to hear from both of you as to what your observations were from the 1880s that you recall.
Well, one thing that Tony Mullane, by not being able to play in 1885, cost himself not only 300 wins, but probably, because of the way the knowledge is now, probably cost himself a place in the Hall of Fame.
Almost certainly, yeah.
And essentially, years ago, I did a presentation at our regional meeting, a SABR meeting, on Jack Burdock, who was a second baseman who was prominent in the 1880s. I did it because one of my friends who also worked at TA was working with somebody who was Burdock's great-grandson. And Burdock hit 330 in 1883 and helped the Boston win the National League pennant, and he probably would have been the MVP of the league if they had won that year. Then in 1884, when hitting started to go down, he went down and hit back to his normal 250, 260. He was rare because he was one of the players from that era that lived till he was 75 years old. He didn't pass away until 1931, and this relative of his had a button or something, a medal that was given to Burdock in 1926 as being one of the few survivors of who played in the first NL season in 1876.
Right, Burdock.
So it was very, putting that together was extremely interesting.
Yeah, Burdock was a very, very interesting player. He ended up playing until 1891, but he had a 3-year hiatus.
Yeah, and I basically decided at the last minute to present it in the context of the times. That was the only way I could really get it across to people.
Yeah.
But also, wasn't, if I'm not correct, wasn't Arthur Soden the owner of the Boston franchise?
He was.
He was basically the proprietor of the reserve clause.
He was. Yeah, he was. And the Boston team always there was always dissension on the Boston team throughout the 1880s and even into the 1890s, and they had some very, very good teams. They won the pennant.
Ian has anything to say.
Well, for me, for the 1880s, you pretty much get Jim Crow creeping in here. You get the gentleman's agreement later in the decade. You get Cap Anson refusing to play, with Bud Fowler on the other teams. He wanted to. So you get the rise of this. You also get the exclusion of women from the sport as well, when the sport was really created in a unisex fashion. And, of course, you get the rise of unionisms. The reserve clause, unfortunately, the courts really didn't see much. Charlie Bennett, who was an outfielder for Detroit, tried to make the leap from the National League team to Pittsburgh of the American Association in 1883. And what happened was he had to re-sign with Detroit in the National League team, and then Pittsburgh, Allegheny Baseball Club versus Bennett, sued, saying that, look, we paid him $100 advance. We should get Bennett on our team. The judge argued that the parties never actually agreed to final terms necessary to execute a contract, and that the agreement between Bennett and Pittsburgh to sign a contract at a later date could not itself be considered a binding contract. Now, when you think about the reserve clause here, it's an agreement to sign another contract at a later date. And because the reserve clause was used to renew contracts entirely on the owner's terms, it lacked the mutuality that the Allegheny Baseball Club and the American Association found to be essential to be the enforcement of a contract. Now, what does this mean? It meant that, hey, the courts really aren't going to touch this, but they wouldn't have to touch it because the baseball owners would be in collusion to enforce the reserve clause, and the courts wouldn't have to get involved. And we'll talk about what happens later on with Landis and the antitrust stuff.
That's a very good point. Is that the reserve clause was essentially tested, but it was always the legal eagles always found for the National League. But where the players won out, and we'll get to a point where they no longer went out. They did have freedom to refuse to go, to refuse to be traded, to refuse to be sold to a different team, especially if they were reserved. Those who were marginal players and substitutes often welcomed being allowed to move or being asked to move to a different team. But the Stars did not have that freedom to move to another team if they wanted to, but they did have the freedom to refuse to be traded. So up until 1885, there were no player sales as such. You could not purchase Charlie Bennett from Detroit for $2,000 or $3,000 unless Bennett wanted to go to your team. You could not trade Jim O'Rourke from Buffalo to New York unless O'Rourke could just refuse to trade. He refused the deal. And generally the better players were with the better teams. They wanted to stay there. They didn't want to be traded to the weaker teams. They simply refused. And there came a point in 1885 where the first player sale in baseball history as such occurred, and was a minor leaguer. A minor league pitcher was actually it was in effect almost a trade. Louisville had a pitcher who was a substitute pitcher, and they more or less sent him to a Southern League team in return for Toad Ramsey, I believe. And Ramsey came to Louisville, and that was the first recognition that a trade or something could occur. And Ramsey wanted to come, and the substitute with the Louisville wanted to come because he wanted to go to the Southern League because it wasn't pitching. But the following year in '86, another trade occurred. Fred Dunlap, who had been the star in the Union Association, wanted to lead the St. Louis team, the Maroons, which entered the National League when the Union Association folded, and he immediately fell out of favor with owner Henry Lucas, and really forced a trade. It was really the first major league trade as such. We can get into that when we get into the 1886 season. But meanwhile, in 1885, because of the World Series the previous year, even though it hadn't been a financial success, between Providence and the New York Mets, 1885, the World Series became a fixture between the two leagues. And Chicago, which won the National League pennant by a very, very close margin over New York. And New York had an incredible team. They had a 750 winning percentage, the highest ever by a second place team. But nevertheless, were out of the running entering the final week of the season because they lost the crucial series to Chicago. And they met up with a newly arriving juggernaut, the St. Louis Browns, who were put together by owner Chris Bondurant, who shamefully has never made the Hall of Fame. Bondurant is a very underrated figure in baseball history, and very influential figure in the American Association leadership and keeping the league intact. And he and Charlie Comiskey, his first baseman, assembled a great team. And they assembled it by picking up bits and pieces from folding Union Association teams. They got Yank Robinson when the Baltimore team folded. They picked up second baseman Sam Barkley from Toledo when the Toledo American Association team folded. they got their players legitimately. They either bought them or got them when they were actually free agents. The New York team, in contrast, kind of shanghaied their players and didn't really work within the rule fabric at that time. But these are the two teams that met in the 1885 World Series, and it's controversial today which team won. Both teams claimed victory at the time, and it was finally decided that each team had won 3 games and there had been one tie. My personal belief is that St. Louis won the series if it had been played out legitimately, but that's a matter of opinion. And then the 1886 season started, and there really weren't any significant rule changes. By this time, the overhand pitching was instrumental throughout baseball. Pitchers were allowed to pitch any way they wanted, any kind of delivery they wanted, from any place in the box they wanted, and hitting still was down pretty much. There were some good averages, there were some good hitting, but basically it was a hunt and peck kind of game where, one would run here and there.
I remember looking through your encyclopedia, and I came across the 1886 American Association Baltimore Orioles, who possibly were the worst hitting team in the history of baseball, Major League Baseball.
Yeah. The Orioles were unbelievably bad, and the Washington National League team was equally bad. They had their team average minus their star player was below 200. They had one player of consequence on the team, and he ended up in Washington because Providence folded, and Washington picked him up as a free. They were actually given him by the league. Outfielder Paul Hines, who was a very, very good player, and it's a very controversial player. And that he won 2 batting championships via today's rules for declaring a batting championship, and was deprived of both of them, and ended up winning none. And he actually won the first Triple Crown in Major League history, and was deprived of that as well. But Hines hit 312, and the rest of the team hit below 200. And they were just an awful, awful team. And the distance between the haves and the have-nots was huge. Even, the last place team would be it was like 50 games or 40 games out of it. And they weren't playing, they were playing like 120 game schedules and 112 games even in 1884. And the quality of baseball, once you got beyond the top teams, was pretty abysmal in some of the cities. Kansas City was another bad team. No team probably was as bad as Baltimore, but Baltimore had been very bad every year since 1882 when it came into the association, except for 1884 when it somehow assembled a above 500 team under Billy Barney. But Barney never again was able to put together as good a team, even though he managed Baltimore throughout most of the rest of its sojourn in the American Association.
Yeah, well,
we come to the 1887 season.
I was just going to ask you about that. That's a whole book by itself.
The 87 season. You're right.
1887. Yeah.
We could actually speak of it if we need to stop at any point. This would be a good place to stop.
Okay, we've got about 20 minutes to go.
20
minutes to go.
Okay. We can enter into the 1887 season, and many, including me, think this was this season and not the 1893 season when the pitching distance was established at its present 60 foot 6 inches. This season was the beginning of modern baseball. The National League and the American Association agreed to play by the same rules. That meant that the hit batsman rule became universal, and it was universal throughout the minor leagues as a result. All the rules that the major league teams were playing by, the minor league teams were playing by as well, with one difference in 1887. 1887, because hitting had been down so much, the averages were way down, and there was an imbalance between hitting and pitching. Two things happened that were one-year only things. The first was that bases on balls were considered to be as good as hits. So if you walked 4 times in a game, you went 4 for 4. If you walked once and struck out the other 3 times, you went 1 for 4. And as a result, batting averages as they existed then were enormously inflated. Outfielder Tip O'Neill for the St. Louis Browns, which won their third straight pennant, hit all of 492 with walks counted as hits. But in addition to counting walks as hits, 2 other changes were made. For the only time in Major League history, 4 strikes were needed for a strikeout. 4 strikes. And in the previous year, Matt Kilroy of Baltimore had set an all-time record, striking out well over 500 batters. And Ramsey of Louisville struck out, I think, 499. And yet in the 1887 season, strikeout totals went way down. But still, the Ramseys and the Kilroys still stayed up in the 200s and 300s. But most of the pitchers had a lot of trouble, and their earned run averages were very inflated as a result of walks counting as hits. 4 strikeouts meant there was a lot more, there was a lot more attention given to walking, a lot more attention given to not striking out. And as a result, more balls were in play, more runners were on base, scoring went up, batting averages, of course, jumped up. The whole game changed. But what is not necessarily noted along with these changes are 2 things. It was the end of the high-low pitch rule. A batter now had a designated strike zone from the tops of his shoulders to the bottoms of his knees. That was it for every batter. Whether you were 5'2", 6'8", regardless, that was your strike zone. You couldn't ask for a low pitch or a high pitch anymore. You got whatever the pitcher served up. And as a result, pitchers like Ramsey really benefited from this, because Ramsey had a really weird pitch. It was a cross between a knuckleball, a knuckle curve, and a slider. And, nobody ever really defined exactly what it was, but it broke down sharply. So if you were used to hitting high balls around your waist, you were going to face a guy who was never going to give you a ball within your your sweet spot. And along with ending the high-low pitch rule, they put an end to the pitcher's motions. Pitchers could no longer run across the box and start, and be delivering the ball as they were running. They had to be stationary when they delivered the ball. You no longer saw guys like jumping Jack Jones, leaping up in the air. As a result of this, a lot of pitching deliveries, which had been very effective, and a lot of pitchers who had been very effective in 84, 85, and 86, went down the tube very quickly. Their careers were all but over. They could not adjust to having to deliver from a stationary position. And this is why I think this was the beginning of modern baseball. Because the pitching delivery became very much like it is today. And it ended, pitchers who did all kinds of crazy things like face away from the batter as they began their delivery and so forth. And what do you guys remember most about the 87 season?
No, okay. When I first got the original Turk and Thompson, I saw these batting averages, and I couldn't believe it. And then, I went to. There's a couple of pages in that book about all the rules changes, and I saw the 4 strikes and walks counted as hits, and I said, "Oh, now I understand." And when I was writing trivia years ago, I looked to see if there was anybody in the American Association that hit 400 for a season outside of 1887, and there weren't. There wasn't anybody. So that was a question that went down the tubes. And I just remember just looking at it and realizing that this was such an aberration to the rest of. I didn't know the depths of it. Obviously, all I know was the 4 strikes and the high bang and the walks counting as hits. And but when you learn this stuff when you're 11, 12 years old, you say, how the hell did they ever do this? And at that age, you really can't understand things in context.
I know. Yeah, I remember that too.
Ian, you have anything to add?
Both of your analysis is pristine and right on target. But like Dave said, and I'll add to both of you, the pitcher's box was reduced to 4 feet by 5.5 feet. 5 balls became the base on balls. 4 called strikes were adopted for this season only. The batter was awarded first base when hit by a pitch, and home plate was used to be both marble and rubber. They dropped the marble type, and this was to be 12 inches square, and coaches were recognized by the rules for the first time ever in 1887.
Also, wasn't that the 1886 off season was when the Chicago sold King Kelly to Boston?
I think it was. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, they had Clarkson also, Chicago, right?
Chicago lost the World Series in '86 to St. Louis, and Al Spalding, who owned Chicago, felt there was, there were too many guys who were, jaking it, and there were too many drinkers on the team, and he started to break up the team. He decided the first guy to get rid of was Mike King Kelly. Kelly certainly was a leader in any team he played on. And Kelly was his own man. He played the way he wanted to play, when he wanted to play, and against who he wanted to play. And there were, a lot of games he sat out, claimed he had sore hands. He was both a catcher and an outfielder. Wasn't particularly good at either position. And there was no position that he was good at. If you look at Kelly's career fielding stats, I believe he was under 900, and he played every single position. I believe his fielding average was under 900 at every single position that he played, and in some it was below 800.
He's a DH.
Kelly was a player sale. Kelly was sold for $10,000, and to get Kelly to go, it's never been confirmed how much, but he was given a piece of that sales price, almost unquestionably. But one thing we have to note too that did occur and is little known today, during the 1887 season, a hitting streak occurred that was never noted really when Joe DiMaggio went on to his 56-game hitting streak. The numbers always given out were the numbers they occurred in the 1890s when Willie Keeler hit for 44 straight games, and Tommy Holmes had hit, for 44 straight in the National League.
No, he hit 37.
He hit 37?
Yeah.
That's right, he got stopped, before he got to Keeler. But DiMaggio's hitting streak, the real target, if you went by the rule, if you regard the rules of the time as inviolate and keep them, was a 52-game hitting streak, which included walks, by Denny Lyons, third baseman with the Philadelphia Athletics. Lyons too, with walks counted as hits, hit over 400. His average was reduced in modern, using modern standards to, I think, 367, somewhere in there. But the Lions' streak. It was written, I believe, either Charles Alexander or someone did a piece on this, or it may have been David Neff, who did a piece in one of the Sabre publications on the hitting streak and how there were a number of games that allowed the streak to continue where Lions got a walk only. But it was considered a legitimate hitting streak in 1887. By the 1890s, it had already been, it was lost in the mists because Nobody and even I was going to mention in the minor leagues in 1887, not all the minor leagues went along with the National League American Association, and they called walks shadow hits. They did not regard them as regular base hits. So there were some minor leagues who counted their batting leader as the guy who had the best batting average minus walk, forget the walks. And there were other leagues that counted their top hitter as the guy who, with the walks included. So there wasn't a uniformity in the rules being enforced as there was in previous years in the minor leagues. And even the American Association, for one, there were some teams in the American Association who had scorers who would make a mark next to a hit that was a walk, and then leave it up and almost make it a matter of discretion whether he was going to count that later in the year when he summarized the team totals. As it wound up, they all did, but there were marks made that for one reason or another were up for grabs.
It's very hard to normalize the averages for that year, even if you removed all the walks because of the 4-strike rule.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Tip O'Neill was a good hitter. He won the batting championship again in 1888, but his average was reduced by over 100 points. The only guy that ever won 2 consecutive batting averages with a 100-point difference in batting average. And everybody, Pete Browning hit over 400 too, legitimately in 1887, largely because of the 4-strike rule. And it was an unpopular rule, but nevertheless, it stuck it out. They stuck it out through the season.
Yeah, they finally settled on 4 and 3 in 1889, I think, right?
Yeah. In 88, they still had 5 balls in 88, 5 balls and 3 strikes, went back to 3 strikes. And then in 1889, it firmly became 4 balls, 3 strikes. So, but in 1887, the game really was a different game than it had been in 1886, with the hit batsman universal, with walks becoming much more prominent. Previous to that, most players disdained getting a walk. They really wanted to hit. They were up there to hit, not to get a walk. But with a walk counting as a hit, and batting averages important by 1887, the players in the contract negotiations, players were out to get a walk. There were guys, the second baseman, Mack, with second baseman with Louisville, who never hit above anywhere close to 300, hit over 400 when walks were counted as hits. Eddie Mack. And that showed really how important walks were that year, because his contract did jump in '88. He was reimbursed for those.
Well, 1888 was 1888 was the Browns winning the fourth pennant, I think, losing the World Series at the time to the Giants, who were
the Browns had lost the series in '87 too.
I saw that the first time I ever saw that they went 15 games, and they were playing after the first bunch of games. They were playing in all different places.
Right.
In 1887, when from what I understand, those games didn't draw very well.
I believe there were some Sunday games mixed in there too, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't think they played Sunday games, and Chicago went along with playing Sunday games in '86.
The American Association had Sunday games. Most of them.
Yeah, they had Sunday games.
Yeah.
They had Sunday. American Association allowed Sunday ball in cities that permitted it. All the cities didn't, but St. Louis certainly did. Cincinnati did.
Yeah.
But Philadelphia didn't. And Philadelphia
didn't do it. Didn't allow it till 1934.
I know. But the American Association team got around it by playing
New Jersey,
some of their Sunday games in Gloucester and Camden and they'd go to in a small town, a resort town, a beach town.
Yeah,
play their Sunday games there.
Okay, and so by the time the 1889 season ended, began with the 4 balls and 3 strikes set in stone, then basically it would be a game that most people would recognize today. The only real thing besides the infield fly rule was the not counting foul balls as strikes.
Not counting foul balls as strike, and still having the pitcher's box.
Yeah,
and
that was done away in 1893. The pitcher's box, and when the distance
done away
was
in '93. But so
yeah.
we were still pitching from a box but the real issue, it's emerging now as an issue in a lot of circles of historians and researchers. When did the mound actually come into existence? And there were pitching mounds, believe it or not, in the 1880s. There were pitchers pitched from a kind of a hill. And the reason for that was not to give them an advantage so much as to help with drainage on the field. When it rained heavily before a game, and if the field were flat and the box was flat, there was no way for it to drain. And by just having a gradual mound, it was a gradual, and then tapering off toward the baselines, they were able to drain the field much more successfully and sweep it too. Sweep it somewhere. So sweeping it down the mound, or help with drainage.
Let's break now. Ian, you have any last words?
No, you know what?
We can resume this next week at some point.
Yeah. We could start the discussion on John Montgomery Ward next week, because in 1888, after the season, they had that world tour with Spalding, and then one of the White Sox players got hurt, and Spalding refused to pay. Yeah, they refused to pay for his hospital bills.
And that's when they put in the classification nonsense that led to the formation of the Players League.
John Brush brought it. And that was a farce. And we can't get into that. And by this time, by 1888, Ward was traded, although the trade was rescinded, was traded to Washington after the 1888 season. But Ward ended up refusing to go. But the Giants were out to get rid of him. They wanted him off the team for obvious reasons, because he was, Ward was, trying to evoke the formation of the Players League, and he had many of his own teammates behind him. Tim Keefe, the leader, and Ward was not popular with Jim Mutry, the Giants manager, or a lot of his teammates.
Well, they put through the classification business when Ward
when he was out of the country.
When he was out of the tour,
he came back and he hit the roof.
Yeah.
That's a good place to start for next week.
Okay.
That's right.
All right, gentlemen. I want to thank you for your participation. Thank you, David. Your knowledge
My
of
pleasure
this
once again. Really enjoyed it.
Extremely encyclopedic. And we'll be back at some point next week, hopefully. So everybody take care. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. And we'll see you guys next week. Take care.
Take care, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.